Good evening and welcome to our webinar, everyone. The webinar this evening you're here to listen to is Sleep Problems and Management in Youth with Tourette Syndrome. My name is Angela Sullivan, Medical Project Specialist, and I will be your moderator for this evening. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During tonight's webinar, we would be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You may ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Human Health and Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. Before we get started this evening, I wanted to take a few minutes to share with you some information about the Tourette Association of America. Here at the TAA, we are dedicated to making life better for all people affected by Tourette syndrome and tic disorders through efforts that raise awareness, advance research and understanding, and provide support. Awareness, research, and support are the three main pillars of our organization, and through these, we are able to provide our community with many resources. In addition to the webinar you will hear this evening, our partnership with the CDC has also allowed us to create an abundance of in-print resources. We have toolkits available for all members of our community, including providers, children, young adults, families, and most recently, we created a toolkit for law enforcement. All of the resources that I just mentioned are available on our website in PDF format and can be mailed to you if needed. More information is on our website. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this evening, Dr. Emily Ricketts. Emily Ricketts is a clinical specialist in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at University of California, Los Angeles, Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Dr. Ricketts received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee following completion of a clinical internship at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. She joined the Child Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, Anxiety, and Tic Disorders program as a National Institute of Mental Health postdoctoral fellow in 2014. Her research centers on the relationship between sleep and circadian disturbance, symptom severity, and underlying neurocognitive mechanisms in Tourette's disorder and obsessive-compulsive spectrum. For example, hair pulling disorder, skin picking disorder, and other disorders. Her research incorporates multimodal assessment of sleep and circadian rhythms, including self-parent report, wearable sleep monitoring devices, and salivary melatonin assessment. She has received funding from the NIMH and Tourette Association of America to evaluate circadian rhythms and the effects of short wavelength wearable light therapy in youth and adults with Tourette's disorder. Without further ado, Dr. Ricketts, please go ahead with your presentation.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon/evening. Let's go ahead and get started. I will be talking about sleep problems and their management in youth with Tourette syndrome. So many of you may have seen this image before. So this is the iceberg. So we know that motor and or vocal tics are really the core of tic disorders, and it varies depending on the specific diagnosis. But we know that underneath the surface there are also many other things that can be happening. ADHD is a really common co-occurring condition. For example, an obsessive compulsive disorder is not far behind in terms of its occurrence. But we also have anxiety, even if kids with Tourette's don't necessarily have a particular diagnosis that they meet for anxiety-wise, they may just still have anxiety. Sorry, my slides are skipping forward. And sleep issues are also a common problem too. So I just wanted to get a little bit sciencey first and talk about the two processes that regulate sleep. So we have process S, which is sleep-wake homeostasis. So this is really referring to how our body tends to promote balance, and it does this with what is called homeostatic sleep drive. And so this just means that the longer we've been awake, the greater our need to sleep. So that is what homeostatic sleep drive is. And so the other process is process C, circadian rhythms. Our circadian rhythm lines up our sleep and wake patterns with the night and day cycle over about 24 hours. So for humans, it's actually 24.2 on average. So that's why I say approximate. And so our circadian rhythm is regulated by a master biological clock in our brain. And our circadian rhythm regulates hormones like melatonin and cortisol, which are pretty key. So melatonin rises in the evening and makes us feel sleepy. And in the morning, cortisol rises and makes us wake up, feel awake. And so it also regulates, brainwave activity, feeding patterns, temperature, and other processes. And although it is a biological process, it is also influenced by factors in the environment, including light, which is the strongest influencing factor, in addition to temperature, eating, and exercise. And so I also wanted to touch on sleep stages. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but this image is really just showing how the sleep stages happen across a sleep period. So we have non-REM sleep or non-rapid eye movement sleep. And so, well, first, actually, I should backtrack and say sleep is like a roller coaster, which is why I put that image there. But it's really just saying sleep is not, we don't just go to sleep and conk out and that's it. But it does occur in different depths. And so starting with non-rapid eye movement sleep, which is staged sleep, it's generally dreamless. We have slow breathing and heart rate, and the stages do increase in depth up until stage 3, and then we hit REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, as it's called. And so, as the name suggests, your eyes are darting around, your breathing is quick, your heart rate is fast and irregular, and you're also dreaming during this stage usually, but your body should be paralyzed. So this is just a general rundown of sleep stages, just because I may touch on these concepts later. So returning to sleep in Tourette syndrome. So sleep problems can occur in up to 65% of youth with Tourette syndrome. In terms of what contributes to this, well, as we saw in the iceberg, co-occurring psychiatric conditions can influence sleep. So ADHD is associated with its own sleep problems as well. OCD may as well. Anxiety definitely does. And so those are all just examples, but a lot of sleep disturbance is common in a lot of different psychiatric conditions. Also, medications can influence sleep. So we'll get into more details on that later. In addition, tic severity. So the more severe that tics are, there may be more sleep disturbance. It may be harder to wind down at night. And tics do wax and wane over time also. And age, there are generally age-related changes in sleep for everyone, and so we would expect that it would contribute here as well. In terms of common sleep problems in Tourette syndrome, so insomnia would be the most common, and really difficulty falling asleep, but also difficulty staying asleep is a problem quite often too. In addition, nighttime anxiety, and I'll go into more detail on all of these in the next slides. Parasomnia, so this refers to unusual behaviors during sleep. They usually happen during non-REM sleep. So things like night terrors, for example. And then there can be tics during sleep as well. And then in addition to those things, there may also just be insufficient sleep, so just not getting enough. So starting with insomnia. So in kids, just to give you a better sense, so in kids it's normally called behavioral insomnia of childhood. So it's it's difficulties falling asleep and or staying asleep. It's often associated with anxiety in this age range, and there are a few different types, so about three different types really, but sleep onset association type is one. So that means that the child feels like they need a parent by their sides to fall asleep, or a specific object, in their beds with them, or even the television on for older kids. And so they feel like they need those things to fall asleep. There's also limit setting type. So that means that, there's some bedtime resistance or refusal. The child is asking maybe a lot of questions, maybe to delay or stall. And then combined type is what it suggests. And the name is really just a combination of both. And as we move into adolescence and, later stages of childhood, you may start to see psychophysiological insomnia, as it's called. So, this is still, difficulties falling asleep, staying asleep, and possibly rising too early for some. But, it may have begun with stressors about school or events or normal worries. But what happens is over time, that as they lose sleep, they start to have or experience, poor functioning in the daytime, and then feel a lot of pressure to fall asleep in the subsequent nights. And so because of this, now they are worrying about their lack of sleep. So now they can't sleep and they're worried about sleep, and this becomes a problem. It makes it harder to fall asleep. So I starred them because that's the key difference between the behavioral insomnia of childhood and the psychophysiological insomnia that can emerge later. And this image is really just showing this psychophysiological insomnia process. And so nighttime anxiety. So, we've kind of touched on that a little bit already, but, kids can have phobias, fears of monsters, darkness, noises, and that can delay bedtime. And also separation anxiety, so worries about being away from their parents can cause problems. Needing a parent to lay with them, going in the parents' bed, and then worries about also real world issues and stressors, so more generalized anxiety kinds of worries, like about school and tests and things like that, the future. And okay, moving on to parasomnia. So remember, these occur during non-REM sleep. And so night terrors, you just want to remember that this is not the same as a nightmare. So this night terrors or sleep terrors are really an awakening that happens during the sleep period. So you wake up, you have an awakening and you are confused and disoriented, and you may cry out, have rapid breathing, racing heart, sweating. But if you were to try to wake up the child, it would be difficult because they are actually still asleep and they usually can't remember what's happening. And and unlike nightmares where you can, and usually they can return to sleep fairly quickly. And this often occurs in the first third of the night, usually about 3 or 4 hours after sleep onset. And then we have nighttime bedwetting. And so this is really referring to urination during sleep that has lasted beyond the age at which bladder control typically begins, which is around 5 or 6, but could be a little bit later in some kids. But for this, we are not talking about the kind of nighttime bedwetting where a child did have control over their bladder but lost it. If that is happening, then that might mean that there is, some kind of emotional disturbance or something going on that's triggering it. Sleepwalking is also another parasomnia that can happen. And so it's not just walking, but it's complex behavior that can happen. Sitting up in bed and looking around, walking around the room or house, or even leaving the house at its, more severe. And again, there's little to no memory of this. It's hard to wake them up because they are actually asleep, and it often occurs within a few hours of falling asleep also. And then moving on to tics during sleep. So 2 studies showed direct evidence of tics during sleep through, video monitoring. So they had patients come through a clinical sleep study. So that's where it's really, also called a sleep EEG or polysomnography. So you're hooked up to wires and they're monitoring your breathing and heart rate and your brain waves during sleep. And but because they had video monitoring, they could also see that tics were happening too. And so there were a couple authors who had reviewed some studies, and their hypothesis was that the reason behind this might be because the part of the brain that is involved in planning and inhibiting movement may be less active during all stages of sleep than it is during the day. And so maybe because of that reason, it may be harder to inhibit tics during sleep. And then some of these polysomnography or sleep EEG studies have shown that there are more tics during REM sleep than non-REM sleep, which is also sometimes called slow wave sleep. But because during REM your body technically should be paralyzed, it does seem kind of odd. But again, they hypothesize that this might be because there is greater brain activity during REM than there is during non-REM. But really, ultimately, more research is needed in this area. And then, as I was saying before, individuals with tics can have less sleep or lower sleep duration than those who don't. And this, we haven't explored exactly what are the specific causes, if it's other sleep problems or if it's just, low sleep duration, but it's really just a repeated pattern of restricted sleep, and over time it just leads to sleep deprivation. And it doesn't mean that there's insomnia or some other issue going on. So that brings me to what is healthy sleep not deprivation, duration. And so this image is from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And so they recommend 9 to 12 hours of sleep is best for school-age kids, 6 to 12 years, and 8 to 10 hours is optimal for kids that are 13 to 18 years, so our adolescents. But don't let this alarm you. I think it's important to remember that, everyone has different sleep needs, and so it's most important to think about, how well your child functions on the sleep that they do get, and how much sleep does your child actually need. And so I do want to touch on barriers to getting enough sleep in adolescence, because there are some changes that do happen that are biological, but also environmental too. So during puberty, there is a shift in the timing of our circadian rhythm. So before, as a kid, they may have been tired around 8 or 9 p.m., but during adolescence, there is the shift where their sleep phase delays about 2 hours or so, and so they may actually be tired around 10 or 11 p.m. or perhaps later. And so this is a sleep phase delay that happens naturally. But there are also other factors in the environment that contribute to this. So homework burden increases as children age, and also, kids become involved in extracurricular activities. They get jobs, that make it harder to get everything they need finished. Screens, looking at light. Light suppresses melatonin. And remember, melatonin rises in the evening to make us sleepy. So if you look at light and suppress it, you will feel less sleepy. And also hanging out with friends can be a barrier, or staying up and talking to them, and early school start times. So the government is starting to work on this, but it varies from state to state. But I know that the bus system kind of influences when kids go to school, but it does seem like high schoolers are the ones who need the most sleep but end up being asked to go to school the earliest. But really, all of this creates a sleep squeeze, and ultimately, kids build up a sleep debt during the week, and on the weekend, they really want to catch up on sleep. But because they try to catch up, this means that come Sunday night, it's harder for them to go to bed at a normal time, and then the cycle continues. But we will return to this when I talk about sleep hygiene later. So how do you know if your child is not getting enough sleep? Well, I think the first sign will be it's hard to get them to wake up. You keep going into their room and they, are barely budging. And it's hard to get them out of bed. They feel sleepy and groggy. They're moody and snappy. They maybe have a poor appetite for breakfast or barely have time to eat it. It's hard for them to even focus on getting ready in the morning, and they may start to get headaches, upset stomach, and things like that. And then during school, or maybe even before school, they perhaps might not even go to school some days, or just be late. They have a lot of daytime sleepiness and yawning, and of course you're not there with them. But these are things that maybe you notice after school. But it's hard for them to concentrate, difficult for them to remember information. You may start to notice changes in their performance or grades, spending less time with friends and withdrawing socially a little bit, and maybe they even become aggressive. And you may, sometimes a kid with sleep problems can start to look like someone who's depressed, but really if you were to address the sleep issues, that would help the most. And then, in terms of after school, you may see your kid run in the door and just kind of crawl into their bed to escape the world. You may notice them taking naps. I should put that in quotes because it may be that they fall asleep for 3 or 4 hours. Or just being sluggish and unmotivated. And then also you may notice changes in their tics. Tics do wax and wane anyway. They wax and wane over time, is their natural course, but there can be factors in the environment that can trigger tics to be worse at specific times than others. And sleep and being tired can be one of those things. And 2 studies have shown a relationship between objective sleep impairment from a clinical sleep study and daytime tic severity. But because that's just it's a correlation, we don't really necessarily know the direction, whether it's poor sleep, is influencing daytime tics, or having worse tics in the day makes sleep worse. So it still needs more research. And then moving on to gearing up to manage sleep, the first step to managing it is really tracking what's happening. So this is an example of a sleep diary. So this is probably more of a standard one. It's in a grid-like fashion. You'd be asked what time the child got into bed, what time did they try to sleep after they got into bed, because we don't always try to sleep right away, how long it took them to fall asleep, how many times they woke up in the night, how long did it last, those kinds of things. And so this is a pretty solid and standard format, but I do want to show you just a different format. I don't want to spend too much time on this part because I do want to spend time on the interventions more, but this one clinically is quite useful, I think, for the parent and also a therapist too, because the days go vertically, and you see the horizontal line is to show that when your child is asleep. The down arrow shows that they got into bed. The up arrow is out of bed, and the way that it shows every day, moving across the page this way, I think visually makes it a lot easier to see what's happening with sleep over time. And then in this grayed out part on the right, and we have instructions here, but this grayed out part on the right, it's showing, you would want to sum up this information. So sleep onset latency, how long it takes you to fall asleep, wake after sleep onset, how much time the child spent awake after they fell asleep, and then the time in bed, so from the down arrow to the up arrow, and then total sleep time. So how much time of the time that they were in bed were they actually asleep? So this is from Flinders University, Michael Gradisar's page, and so I've included the link, but I do think this is a really helpful format to use. And then these are the instructions, but we will keep going. So shifting to managing sleep. So I think the first things to talk about are just general sleep hygiene. So we do want to make sure that your child is getting sufficient sleep. Just because we were talking about how being tired can make tics worse at times. Having an established, consistent bedtime routine is important. So we as much as possible, we want the child to be going to bed at the same time each night. We don't want an erratic schedule, because sleep variability can actually impair. It can have kind of consequences that are harmful, and so the consistent bedtime schedule is important, and also making sure that there's not too much light going on, that if your child needs a night light because of anxiety, that perhaps you choose one that is a red color or tint. The red wavelength does seem to cause less disturbance in sleep than, or I guess it doesn't really have an effect on sleep, whereas the white and blue and green kind of wavelengths can affect sleep. And so maybe a dim red light, I think, would be helpful for a nightlight. Also making sure that there's, low noise, making sure that the temperature is optimal. I think anything higher than 75 degrees can be a little bit, I guess, less desirable for our bodies to sleep. And and also the screens as well. So, in addition to the light from screens, being on them too close to bed is stimulating. And so, that in itself, the activity that you're doing on them can keep you awake. So we need wind down time. And addressing, I think, barriers to getting enough sleep are important, especially, the ones that we were talking about with the teens, but also it can affect younger kids too. Homework, extracurricular activities, jobs. Poor time management can be a big thing. Helping our kids to manage their time, not procrastinate, not leave the science fair project until the last minute, those kinds of things. And then we also need to think about meal timing and kind of these factors that can affect our physiology. So meal timing can influence our sleep and our circadian rhythm. And so, that's an important thing to consider. Also, exercise. If you're exercising beyond, or I guess within 3 hours of bed, then I think that can start to keep you awake. Also, obviously drinking caffeine within 4 hours of bedtime can be a problematic. And then also showers are something that I think can kind of be confusing because it's been talked about differently. But a shower is a great part of a nightly bedtime routine because it is relaxing, but I think it's important to leave. It is important to leave a space of 90 minutes or so, because what happens is the showers raise your body temperature and it can make it harder for you to fall asleep because of that reason. Also, using a real alarm clock instead of the phone, I think is important because you want to, as much as possible, keep the child off of the phone. And so if the excuse is that, oh, it's my alarm clock, then it is going to be right next to their bed. So having a real alarm clock is good. And then also the bed is for sleeping and everywhere else is not for sleeping as much as possible. So we don't want them doing homework on the bed, or watching TV on their laptop or something like that. Especially if there are problems with sleep, we want to try to just make the bed for sleeping. Avoiding after school naps as much as possible is important. So remember when I was talking about homeostatic sleep pressure, and drive, when you take a nap, you are filling up on your fuel. And so you are ultimately easing that pressure a little bit. So then it is harder to go to bed at night. Weekend catch-up sleep, this one is a catch-22. We do want them to get enough sleep. We don't want our kids running around with insufficient sleep. And weekend catch-up sleep is okay within limits, but ultimately you do want to see a wake-up time on the weekend that is within 2 hours of the wake-up time during the week, as much as possible. Another presenter recently had suggested actually that even if they do sleep in, if you go in and open the curtains and let in the sunlight, that actually may be quite beneficial, because as I was talking about, light is the strongest circadian influencing agent. And so getting natural light as soon as possible is really important. So moving on to insomnia. So I want to talk about bedtime restriction. So this is a behavioral intervention that involves temporarily shifting the child's bedtime later to help the child fall asleep faster and more independently. So the goal here is that time in bed should really be equivalent to the time asleep, that we don't want someone in bed not sleeping. So it's appropriate to use this for difficulties falling asleep, needing a parent in the kids' room or the kid in the parents' room, bedtime resistance or refusal, anxiety about bedtime, frequent, waking up in the middle of the night. And what it looks like is you're going to use your sleep diary to track sleep for a week. And then what you want to do is calculate the average nightly sleep duration across that week. And then, so you take, each night's sleep duration, add it up and divide it by the number of nights to get the average. And then what you want to do is you want to choose a wake-up time for your child that works for your child and your family and for getting to school on time. So you are going to pick one. And then to make the new temporary bedtime for your child, you are going to take the new wake-up time and you will minus the sleep duration, the average sleep duration for the week. So this will be your new target bedtime, and you will use it for 1 week. And so 1 week is in a first week. try it out and see how it's going. So ultimately, the child, even though their bedtime is later, we want them to be doing a quiet pre-bedtime activities. It's not suddenly a fun thing that they get to stay up later. There needs to be wind down time as well. And then, if you find that the child is having less sleep problems, then you would start shifting it earlier in intervals. And in Michael Gradisar's practice, as professor at Flinders, he had commented that, he had seen a 7-year-old going to bed at 11. So, it could come to that, but it's only temporary. You are working backwards. But that's what it looks like ultimately. And, the best bedtime is really when the child is not sleeping in the day and they're taking about 15 minutes to fall asleep. And then I want to move on to sleep restriction. So this is another strategy that can be used. So the other one is just restricting the bedtime. But this one is actually restricting the sleep as well. So both of these interventions are really designed to, influence sleep pressure and kind of manipulate that to help. And so this one works faster than bedtime restriction, but at present, we don't know if it works. We don't know which one works better necessarily. So, but if your child has parasomnias, you don't want to use this one because sometimes parasomnias can be a result of insufficient sleep. So, but generally, this is appropriate for all the sleep problems that bedtime restriction is appropriate for too. If your child frequently gets up in the night, it seems like sleep restriction may be optimal. So with sleep restriction, ultimately, you're really doing the same thing that you did for bedtime restriction. So it's the same kind of process. You use the sleep diary, you calculate the average sleep, you select the wake up time, and then you take the wake up time that you've chosen, and you minus the average sleep duration. And then when you get that bedtime, the difference is that you now have to make it later by 30 minutes. So that's the difference. So now you've chopped off 30 minutes from it and pushed it a little bit later. So now you have restricted sleep. So you're going to use this bedtime for about a week, and then you will start shifting it earlier in about 30 or 15-minute intervals. So that is generally sleep restriction. And so returning to the psychophysiological insomnia that can happen. So that's when, as I was saying, when your child is worrying about getting enough sleep while they're in bed trying to sleep. Thought challenging can be useful for this as well, sometimes called cognitive restructuring, but it's really just challenging unhelpful thoughts about sleep. But these are just examples, but I must get my full 8 hours. I will never fall asleep. I won't be able to function tomorrow. And you may have caught yourself saying things like this too, but these kinds of thoughts aren't helpful, and you do want to help the child challenge these. And I will get more into the details on thought challenging later with a different example. And then, we also talked about how kids can have, more, I guess, realistic worries about events that are coming up or the future, generalized anxiety. Savoring is a strategy that has shown some benefits for this kind of, or I guess sleep problems related to this kind of worry. So savoring can involve, writing or journaling about positive events, whether they happen in the past or they're upcoming, and the associated feelings that they bring to you. And so you really want to work on writing down the details and specifics. And then ultimately what you want to do is imagine watching this event play out on television, like on a television screen in front of you. And you would also be asked to write about the kind of negative or the worry thoughts that you're having as well. And you would want to write down the details of those and try to imagine watching those on a television too. And what you were doing is you were learning to switch between positive channel, or you're learning to switch to a positive channel when you're stuck on a worry channel at bedtime. So the therapist may have the child practice switching back and forth for minutes at a time. And then these also for this kind of worry, other strategies that are commonly used are relaxed or diaphragmatic breathing, and progressive muscle relaxation. So for relaxed breathing, you have one hand on your chest, the other on your stomach, and this is really just as you're learning it, not every time, but you want to breathe in through the nose for 4 seconds and out through the mouth for 6 seconds, and you're really focusing on the exhale, going slowly, and the child wants to focus on blowing up their tummy like a balloon, but making sure they keep the hand on their chest pretty still. And then in terms of progressive muscle relaxation, that's really tensing and relaxing different muscle groups. So squeezing, 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 like your fists, for example, clenching, clenching, and then releasing. So to help ease tension. And these strategies are helpful for tics, and they are part of behavioral treatment for tics too. And some of these things, you don't necessarily need to do them in the bed. If they can be done in the day or during the wind down time, but something like breathing that could be done in the bed as well. So returning to this, separation anxiety, and so whether it's sleeping in the parent's bed or needing the parent to come to the child's bed, some of that can be helped with bedtime restriction and sleep restriction, but it can also be helped with exposure and response prevention. So ultimately, what you would need to do is help your child create a fear ladder. So we have our example on this side, which is really a hierarchy of sleeping arrangements in order from least anxiety provoking to most anxiety provoking, and you want to have your child rate them, rate each one, and to make this order. But the child is really just climbing this ladder. And so an example, the child first, this is for a child who is sleeping in the parent's bed, but maybe first you'll put a mattress on the floor of your bedroom and have the child sleep on the mattress. And then maybe you'll move the mattress closer to the door or outside your bedroom door with your door open. And then maybe the parent will sleep on a mattress in the kids' room. And then the parent can stay on sit on a chair and watch the child fall asleep and then leave the room. And then, working steadily towards sleeping independently. And, this is a pretty short list. It's just an example. There would probably be more steps. But that's another thing that can be used. And then returning to nighttime fears that are maybe less realistic. So talking about challenging worry-related thoughts. So we look at the little circle, we have situations or events, and they trigger thoughts, and thoughts trigger feelings of, and emotions of whatever kind. And then this affects how we behave. In this instance, it affects how we sleep. So an example of situation is a child heard a noise. The thought is, oh my gosh, it's a burglar, someone's trying to break in. They feel scared or nervous. Usually if you're working with a therapist, they may have the child try to identify what kind of thinking trap that falls into. So in this case, catastrophizing, so kind of blowing it out of proportion, thinking that it's the worst thing, and then overestimation, maybe overestimating the likelihood of danger in that situation. And then you want to have the child think, how realistic is that thought that someone is breaking in, based on this noise you heard outside? What is the evidence for it? What is the evidence against it? And then you want them to come up with a more balanced thought. A more balanced thought might be that a trash can blew over, or maybe an animal made that noise. Okay, so shifting to parasomnias. So for parasomnias, scheduled awakenings is what you would typically use. So this would be what you use if the child is getting enough sleep. If they're not, then you would want to use something else, which we'll talk about next. But you want to find out basically what time the problem is happening, but then you want to wake the child 15 to 20 minutes before you think the parasomnia would be occurring. But you don't want to wake, you don't want them fully, I guess you want them to be sleepy still. You don't want to like totally wake them up. You want to make sure the lights are dim, it's not noisy. And if it's sleep terrors, again, you're going to sit them up in bed for a few minutes, wake them up, but keep them sleepy. If it's bedwetting, also make sure to limit the amount of, like the drinks that they're having before bed, and also make sure to direct them to the toilet as well. If your child isn't getting enough sleep, you'll want to use sleep extension, and when they have parasomnias. And so you want to ultimately move their bedtime earlier by 15 minutes, hold it for a week, and then if no change, move it earlier by an additional 15 minutes. And ultimately, you're stopping when the child is able to fall asleep pretty easily in under 20 minutes, and the parasomnias have stopped. So these are all just different strategies for parasomnias, but also you can use some devices. So there are alarms for bedwetting. They sense, so like underpants that sense moisture, and they may come with a strap or some kind of device that will vibrate and wake the child up, or maybe beep, just so they can try to catch it and go to the bathroom. Then there's also a device for night terrors called the Lully Sleep Guardian, and so it is ultimately a device that can do the awakening for you as well, by vibrating and waking the child up. It does require some tracking at first, but yeah. So these are to help with awakening, and I've listed the website here. It may be sold out at this time, but it will come back. And then moving on to medications. I'm going to have to rush now because we're nearing the end, but so medications for tics, I think the sleep problem that they tend to be linked to more so is daytime sleepiness. But newer medications like clonidine and guanfacine, which are the first line for tics, they tend to be more tolerable than antipsychotic medications because of the producing less adverse effects. Clonidine is a pretty interesting one, and relevant for the topic today, because it can help with tics and hyperactivity, but it may also facilitate sleep onset too. And so, sometimes a low dose at night may be prescribed in kids who have sleeping problems related to tics or hyperactivity. But it does also have some daytime sleepiness effects. Guanfacine has fewer daytime sleepiness effects than clonidine, but it doesn't have it doesn't help you fall asleep the way that clonidine does. And then stimulant medications are also an issue too. They are often linked with difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, particularly Ritalin and Adderall. A meta-analysis was trying to tease out findings from different studies, and it looked like extended release once a day may have fewer, or may be associated with fewer sleep problems than immediate release 3 times a day. So that's just a little tidbit. And also Strattera may be associated with fewer sleep problems too, and reduced tics in kids who have ADHD and co-occurring tic disorder. But more research is needed on these. And ultimately, I'm a clinical specialist and not a psychiatrist. But if you notice changes in your child's sleep or daytime alertness, then it's important to check in with the doctor and see if the dose can be adjusted. But in terms of medications or other medications that may help sleep for kids, there really aren't any FDA-approved medications for addressing sleep in kids yet at this time. Melatonin is an over-the-counter substance, and it is commonly used. It does have different effects if given at different times. And so if you take it about 30 to 60 minutes before bed, it can, it will induce sleep. It will have what's called a hypnotic effect or sleep-inducing effect. But it can have a more dramatic effect if taken at different times. So it can have a circadian phase shifting effect if you took it, for example, at dusk or 3 to 4 hours before bed. It will advance your circadian rhythm. And if you take it at dawn or when you're waking up, it could delay you. Use over a short period or shorter term is fine. There are some concerns. So a lot of studies that look at melatonin do it in kids who are ages 6 to 12 or so. There are some concerns for use of melatonin in prepubertal and pubertal kids, because what happens is as children age, melatonin starts decreasing. And this decrease in melatonin makes gonadotropin rise, which kicks off puberty. So I think the worry was that if you started giving melatonin to kids that were older over a longer period of time, that it might interfere with pubertal development. But we don't actually know what it looks like long term. It's possible that maybe it doesn't work exactly how you think, and it wouldn't be a problem. But I think people really just don't study it in older kids because of that concern. 0.5 milligrams to 1 milligram is a good dose to start with. You probably don't need more than 3 or 6 milligrams at a time. But it's important to talk to the pediatrician or doctor if you're interested in using melatonin. And for all sleep interventions, we actually do not yet know. Well, I guess really here we're talking about melatonin, but we don't yet know if it helps tics. I think there's some clinically or anecdotally parents might talk about how they feel like it might help tics sometimes, or maybe sometimes they might think it makes it worse. I don't know, but the studies haven't actually looked at that yet. And then I'm going to touch on light therapy. Light therapy would be appropriate for, I think, adolescents and above, really. Light, the lens of the eye is pretty sensitive to light in younger kids. So it's more for adolescents, and it's especially good for the ones who are hitting that delay in sleep phase. But it can advance or delay you depending on the time that you use it. So light at night will delay you, and light in the morning will advance you. It's not really that great for people who have bipolar disorder because it can trigger mania. It's not that it has never been used, because research studies have used it, but it's a warning ultimately. So people can use light boxes for light therapy. They range from 2,500 lux, which is intensity, to 10,000. And ultimately that's to really help shift your circadian phase in whichever direction, but it can also help depression, seasonal affective disorder, things like that. And some research has shown that light, I guess green blue light may be more effective or stronger at phase shifting than broad spectrum white light. And so that is an area of research now too. And but yeah, for light therapy, ultimately you would begin on the weekend by sleeping in until your natural rise time and then start shifting backward by 15 to 30 minutes each day. And also remember the sun is 20,000 lux, and lux, sorry, is the measure of the intensity of light around your eyes. And so the greatest thing would be to just go outside in the morning and just get some morning light for an hour. Yeah, so these are resources. This is Rachel Hiller and Michael Gradisar's book, Helping Your Child with Sleep Problems. So a lot of the guidance on bedtime restriction, sleep restriction comes from that. The Insomnia workbook for teens is also helpful. It has a good script for savoring. And then I've also included, I didn't touch on mindfulness here, but there is a website, Headspace, that has an audio meditation for sleep that can be used too. And then these are just current research studies that we have going on. So we have some internet surveys, and also, so they're looking at chronotype, or our morningness, eveningness patterns, in addition to other sleep measures. And then we also have some in-person circadian rhythms and wearable light therapy research going on, both in kids and adults. And you can contact Gabrielle at the contact information listed. So yeah, and then I've listed references here if you need to find anything. And let's move on to questions quickly. I know we are running out of time, so.
Thank you so much, Emily. We are now going to begin answering the questions that were submitted during tonight's presentation. We have a few already, but as a reminder, you can still submit any questions you have through the questions pane on your control panel. We'll probably spend about 10 minutes answering questions. If we aren't able to get to everyone's question, here at the TAA, we do have a full-time information and referral staff who can help answer any questions that you do have that weren't answered. Or you could email support@tourette.org or call us at 1-888-4-TOURETTE. So, Emily, I have a few questions here for you already.
Okay, I will do my best.
I can see where sleep tracking is useful, but how practical is it to obtain with a less than cooperative child? How reliable is it in this setting?
No, that's a really good question. Ultimately, with a child, you do need some help from a parent to do it. I think it may be more so the parent driving it than the child. When you get to older kids, and also parents do tend to have more knowledge about their child's sleep, the young children. When you get to the teen years, you probably do really need the teen or the prepubertal kids to do it themselves. They probably know more about their sleep than the parent does, but that's because they start going to bed later than their parents. And so then the parents have less information. But yeah, for kids, it is helpful when there is a parent, even if the parent isn't doing it, filling it out, but if they are prompting them to fill it out. So ultimately, sometimes what we see is kids will come in, from the week, and it's possible they might be trying to fill out the sleep diary for the whole week in the waiting room, just from their memory. And so if that's the case, then it's not really going to be that useful or reliable. But I think, yeah, where the parent comes in is maybe reminding them to do it. But yeah, it is an issue. It is a real issue.
Great, thank you. Next question, is reading a good bedtime activity?
That's a good question. Yeah, I do think it is. It is a good pre-bedtime activity. Reading, it's quiet. And I think what you do, and I guess the question would be whether you do it in bed or not. I think that whether you do it in bed depends on if you have, insomnia or, a sleep problem that might influence that. I suppose if you don't have insomnia, then I think it's fine to read in bed. If you do, you probably just want to sleep in the bed and read somewhere else before bed, if that makes sense.
Great, yeah. Okay, so we have someone that submitted a few different questions. I believe you just touched upon one, but I'll ask
Okay.
them. So are naps ever normal, like a siesta?
Um, I mean, a short nap is fine, but we're talking 20 minutes. So, like a little cat nap is
Mm-hmm.
okay. But, when you're going longer than that, then it can become a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I believe you just touched on the use of melatonin, but if you
Mhm.
wanted to give us your thoughts on the use of melatonin for trouble falling asleep if behavioral techniques don't work.
Uh, um, let's see. I mean, I think that, I guess I'm wondering if, I'm not sure it's been compared officially, but yeah, I mean, there's no harm in trying melatonin if the behavioral techniques haven't worked.
Mm-hmm.
Mm, yeah.
Okay.
So I think, yeah.
Great. And the last part of this three-part question, what about narcolepsy? This person has heard that there is a connection between narcolepsy and OCD spectrum disorder slash Tourette syndrome.
Oh. Um, that one, I think I would have to investigate a little bit more, especially because I guess this was more about kids, and
Mm-hmm.
that would probably be something that would come into fold more for the adults. But I mean, I've heard of people having I've heard of it come up more in a differential diagnosis kind of issue where the person had narcolepsy and the doctor thought it was a tic, but it was actually narcolepsy. They also
Okay.
have tics too, but yeah, I know this isn't what this question is necessarily referring to. So yeah, that would be one I'd have to look up and get back to you on. So let me write that one
Okay.
down.
Okay.
Question.
Next question. How do we stop TV as a sleep tool? Their child only sleeps with the TV on, so do you have any recommendations on how they could remove it cold turkey?
Okay. Well, I think, ultimately, well, one thing is which I didn't talk about, when you're trying to do any kind of intervention with kids, you do want to make sure that you are rewarding them for their efforts. And so we do like to use reward systems where we're giving them points that they can turn in for, um, you know, rewards, whether that's hanging out with a friend, or, going to get ice cream or something like that. So that is one tool, but ultimately you want to start. You could technically use exposure for this, but if there were a way to put to leave something else on, some other kind of device on in the room and take the TV out and kind of work downwards, then that might be one strategy that you could use. You could also try putting them to bed when they're a little bit more tired too, like using the bedtime restriction and sleep restriction. That can also help with these kinds of problems as well. But yeah, I think making a hierarchy and working downwards could work also. It can work for other kinds of problems, like when kids feel like they need like a particular stuffed animal or something like that. So kind of if there's like an iPad, maybe that could go in there, um, or something smaller.
Okay, great. We'll take a few more questions. So, if tics are the main culprit of the trouble sleeping, is increasing medicine the only help?
Um, no, I mean not necessarily, but I mean, I think just making sure to address the tics in general. So whether that's behavior therapy or medication, but I think ultimately we don't necessarily know if it might not necessarily be the case that the tics are what is keeping somebody up at night. It's possible that there's something about having Tourette's that creates, or there's some other process in the brain that makes it so that you have Tourette's and you also have a separate sleep problem too. So it might not necessarily be that Tourette's are directly the thing driving the sleep problem. But yeah, you could use behavior therapy to try to address tics if that was, what was keeping you up at night. And you can also try the clonidine, which was the one that seemed to show sleep benefits. But also if the sleep problems are separate, then you'd want to use those interventions that, whether they be behavioral or behavioral treatment for insomnia or, the bedtime restriction and challenging your thoughts, those kinds of things can also be helpful too. So.
Okay. So 2 more questions. Do adults with Tourette syndrome typically need more sleep than other adults?
That's a good question. We actually don't know that answer. I mean, I would imagine they probably need about the same sleep as other people, but I would imagine they probably get less sleep. But yeah, the fact that they might get less sleep doesn't necessarily mean that they need more than others, but they probably just need the same as would be my guess. But yeah, we haven't looked at that. So yeah, it's a good question.
Okay. And are the suggested behavioral therapies implemented without melatonin?
Yeah. So those are used without melatonin, but there would be no problem with you using melatonin at the same time. I know, especially like for example, although not the behavioral therapy, but with light therapy, I know for kids who are delaying in their sleep phase, Michael Gradisar actually uses both melatonin pills and the light therapy too. So yeah, you can definitely use melatonin with the strategies.
Alrighty, well that is all the questions that we received. So we're going to end the Q&A here. Just a reminder, if you do have any additional questions regarding this specific topic or anything else, you're more than welcome to reach out to us and we can liaise between you and Dr. Ricketts, or if there's something that the TAA can help you with, we're more than happy to help. So thank you again for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Ricketts. This is all the time that we have for our webinar. Once the webinar is closed, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would be greatly appreciative if you could please complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of tonight's webinar. Additionally, the webinar will be posted on the Tourette Association YouTube channel for those who are unable to participate today. We encourage you to reach out to us on social media about this webinar or for any other ideas and suggestions that you may have. On behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view our webinar and presentation. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you again, Dr. Ricketts.
Thank you. Night, everyone.